good.
No, there's two more people. Is there not,
Can
are
you-
you a translator of the yellow page?
I don't know, but if you can all, if you have two translators, maybe put
Move
in
that
two
to the
groups.
Yeah, okay.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you all so much. We're now ready for our final speaker of the day, and just an amazing time we've had. At the end of this talk, I've been asked to send you all up to the Minka Mall for a short closing ceremony and a photograph. We're also going to have a drawing for the washi lamps for Ukraine support. So all of that's going to happen right after here, and it won't happen before. So there's no need to leave to get up there until we're done with this talk. So my final haiku. Are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Alrighty. Azby, many sides. Citizen science, art, book. So articulate.
Thank you. Thanks, Wendy. It's really very kind. I've had a great weekend. Didn't know what to expect. Logistics, I had to get here from Yokohama. Actually, I have to get back to Yokohama tonight. But it's been really, really moving and interesting for me. And so I was thinking about my presentation for the past couple of days and kind of tweaking it. And I want to talk a little bit about my journey, so to speak, and try to put some of these issues that we're all thinking about with Minka into some broader context. I just called it Legacy, Lessons, and Future. So the first thing is that I'm from New Orleans. And how many of you have been to New Orleans? Well, then you know. So New Orleans was kind of unique in the United States as an old city. And I grew up, in a very old house, and everyone I knew lived in old houses. 100 years old was nothing. And there's kind of an interesting reason why so much of the old city was preserved. In fact, it has to do with the bad economy after the Civil War. Like a lot of the South, it was sort of stagnant economy, so there wasn't a lot of new building in the old parts of town. They kept the older buildings in use for a long time. And then the 20th century comes, and by the 1920s, visitors were saying, wow, what a charming and romantic town. Basically, people were too poor to knock them down and build new ones. That was the fundamental economic cause, but it left them with something really, really special. So, and of course, a lot of the city is touristic. This is a French Quarter. It's very touristic, but people normally live in old houses. And I say that people from New Orleans, and this is true for other parts of the United States, certainly in Europe, if the house, there's two houses. One is 150 years old. One is very recent. They're similar in size and similar in cost. Almost everybody will choose the old house. And I just thought that was normal. Just like I thought it was normal to love your hometown. So when I went to college, I was very, very surprised that not everybody loved their hometowns. And this is, an interior which is aged, and this is intentionally highlighting the age of the thing. And this would be considered someone with pretty good taste. So that things are aged, that the buildings in your neighborhood talks to you, identifies you, helps you know who you are, connects you with the stories of the people who were there before you. That this is all very, very essential stuff. So I went to college and didn't know much about Japan to begin with, but I was fortunate. I had a roommate whose father was in the State Department and had served in Tokyo and also in Seoul, and he had a lot of information and books, and one of my professors had spent a year learning paper making in Japan, and the library was great. At the time, I also want to point this out, and this is just going to show, I think, not just how old I am, but how things change. I was very interested in Japanese architecture at college, and this is Yale University. It's a very well endowed, very broadly capable university, and there were no courses on Japanese architecture. There was not a single one. There were some art history courses. I took Chinese art history. I took a few other things, but there was nothing. So fortunately, I was able to make a a seminar, a kind of tutorial for myself with one professor, and that was a lot of my final year in college was spent with that. Now, almost any university, certainly any place with an architecture school, will have courses, maybe more than one, on Japanese architecture. It has become recognized, the interest is clear, it's broad, and even all of you are here now in many ways jumping in to participate with Japanese architecture. To me, this is a remarkable change over the course of a few decades. So one of the books that was in the library at Yale was this book. It's by Yukio Futagawa, the photographer, text by Teiji Ito. This is Nihon no Minka. And there's later an English language translation came out. I think this one had some basic captions in English. And it was remarkable. It was just a window to another world for me. Black and white photographs of the Minka. Most of them were taken during the 1950s. He went all over the country, spent years and years documenting traditional architecture, traditional houses, and just as they are. So they were not cleaned up or spiffed up for the photograph in general. They were lived in, they were worn, dingy in some ways, and really old. And I remember, just seeing one picture. I couldn't find a copy of it, but this is something similar to this. It was the Daikoku Bashira, and wow, what is a Daikoku Bashira? But it looked like a living god, somehow dwelling in the middle of this house. And this was really, had a really deep impression on me. And I decided I wanted to try to come to Japan, which took a few years. And yesterday, interestingly, the name Weatherby and Weatherhill came up. And this was one of the first books that I think was in English on Japanese Minka from the Weatherhill Heibonsha survey. And this is also the text by Teiji Ito. So I also checked this book out of the library. I have a copy of it myself I bought later. The point being that there was not a lot of information, certainly not in English, and that sort of affected me in how I decided what I ultimately ended up writing about and how I wrote about it. So for me, I finally was able to come to Japan in 1982 for a few weeks, and then finally in 1985 came back, came back first in 1983 and then in 1985. And I realized nobody was living in old houses. My impressions were wrong. I thought I knew what Japan was going to be about, and it wasn't the case. And this is the question. And I've had this question. We've been talking about this all weekend. Why don't Japanese people want to live in old houses? Does anybody want to throw out what they think might be the cause?
It's not good for the economy.
Okay. That's an interesting one, but that's assuming there's great selflessness on the part of people that they're doing it for the economy, but maybe there's something else?
They're not comfortable.
They're not comfortable. That's a biggie, right? Something else?
Comfort and lighting.
Lighting. They're dark. Not comfortable, dark. One more maybe.
Ningen kange, the relations with neighbors around the house.
Neighbors, relationships, something about human relationships. One more?
The cost of it.
Say again?
The cost of renovating.
The cost of renovating, if it's renovating, can be. All of these things are true. Cold, yes. Most of these things were also true in New Orleans. I mean, not so cold, but in America. But people wanted to live in old houses, and industry responded with ways to retrofit the plumbing and the insulation and everything else. And I think if Japanese people really want to do it, industry would find the solutions, and it's already happening. So to me, this is a very, very puzzling thing, and I would want to add, speaking with my Japanese mother-in-law, ghosts, tamashi. For her, it was like, no, I'm not going to live someplace like that, someone else's house, because there's tamashi. And if they had good luck, they wouldn't have had to get rid of the house, kind of a thing. So she doesn't want to get their bad juju. I was fortunate to meet the last great temple carpenter of Japan. I say that only because he was able to build entire temples. He was working on Yakushiji at the time, Nishioka Tsunekazu, who was part of the hereditary family of temple carpenters, Miyadaiko of Horyuji Temple. Maybe many of you know about him. And it was just sort of chance, and I was lucky, sort of comedy of errors, I was able to meet him. At the time, I was like 27 years old. I thought I wanted to be a Japanese carpenter, and he said he would take me on as an apprentice, and I went and thought about this a little more and realized I really didn't have the temperament for 7 or 8 years of obedience. And then I went back and I said, well, I want to come back to study, would you let me document your work? And he said yes. So I became kind of a special category apprentice and spent 3 years researching at Yakushiji Temple while I entered the University of Tokyo master's degree program. And so this temple was built, it dates right before 700 and then was moved, so around 710 AD. And it means it's originally 1,300 years old. And this is the Eastern Pagoda, which is original. This building is 1,300 years old. Now, not every component, it's been, modified and repaired, etc., but quite a lot of the original wood is still in this building. And when Nishioka was working on this project, first they built the kondo. There's a story about that where the bunkacho refused to let him make it entirely out of wood because of the importance of the Buddhist sculptures inside. So there's a concrete structure protecting those and wood on the outside. And then he made the Saito, the Western Pagoda, as closely as possible, following the original. So he and his apprentices climbed all over this and measured it minutely, and he built this, and it took a decade, basically, and it's a remarkable piece of work. So, I was able to go back. I got the grant from the Ministry of Education, and largely on the basis of the recommendation letter he wrote for me on washi with a brush. I just remember when the people at the consulate in New York, they opened it up, it was almost like, you're in. And I went back and everything was so different than I had expected. So I was used to carpentry and building sites in the States, and they're sort of noisy and rowdy and the radio's blaring and guys are, horseplay. It was none of that. It was quiet. The people were focused on the work, working calmly, without words, communicating without words, almost like a dance of people. The smell of the hinoki, this was one of the biggest impressions on me. Walking in going, what is this smell? It's incredible, it's like an aromatherapy, all day long. And, I saw a lot of work, and a lot of it was very puzzling and had a lot of questions about it. This was he was a 16-year-old apprentice, kind of small, but Nishioka Toryo thought he would be good at detailed work, so he gave him this kind of work to do. And this person, he was like a fukutoryo, like a second rank, he had people he was sort of directing under. It was really, really amazing, and watching the whole thing go together. Of course, at the time, being an American, I have to add that when I was in university, I became interested in wood joinery in general. Of course, Japanese wooden joinery as the epitome of that. But there was starting a revival in the 1970s in the U.S. for timber framing, because it had pretty much died out. And I would go to flea markets to try to find old chisels and things, and go to the library to check out 19th century carpentry manuals to learn about this stuff. So I was sort of self-taught. But for a Westerner to be a good carpenter largely means the dimensions are correct and the finish is nice, and that's about it. But and I'll touch on this more later, that is the bare minimum. That's a given. That goes without saying for a Japanese carpenter. There's a whole nother level of understanding, particularly of trees as living beings, and a lot of things that go along with that. So it was it was a very formative, life-changing experience for me, and put me on a different direction. And one of the keys is this notion of 1,000 years. And I would go to talk to the master occasionally, and I would make an appointment, and I would have questions, and he would sit and he would answer them very kindly. He was a very kind man to me. He wasn't kind to his apprentices, I don't think, but they never saw that side. He was kind to me, and he always would answer. And of course, if I had been an apprentice, I couldn't have even asked questions, right? And always the answers would come back to trees as a living creature, the environment that they grew in, their unique characteristics, etc. Almost everything. So often when the building is completed, being erected, there are gaps in many places, And those are intentional. He said, oh, that's because, after, 50 years, then this will have settled and that gap will have closed. So it's not really a finished thing, it's still a dynamic process. But this whole notion of 1,000 years, this is hard to see from the back, but this is like when the temple was built, Yakushiji 700 AD. This is now. This is the year 1000, Heian period. This is the year 0, 500 BC. So it was very certain, based on ring dating, that the trees used in original Yakushiji and in Horyuji at the time were 1,000 years old when they were cut, and then the building was well built and was more than 1,000 years old and can continue indefinitely, theoretically. Meanwhile, for the new work at Yakushiji that's happening during this time period, those trees, they were able to get some 1,000-year-old trees. They were not able to source them in Japan. They had to get them from Taiwan, and they're a little bit different. But these were 1,000 years old, so this process is starting here, and it's being built for 1,000 years. And it took a while for that to sink in. So this entire continuum is several millennia of a single wooden building or a set of wooden buildings. And that was mind-blowing. It was kind of like a depth charge. I said, oh yes, okay, I get it. And then later it was like, whoa, he really was thinking of that, not as rhetoric. This was actually what he was doing, what he has been taught to do, what is important for him and for all carpenters learning his way. And this is, what's called the kuden, which are the oral teachings, and there's sort of 10 of them, I think, and I won't go through all of them, but this is sort of word of mouth passed down from master to apprentice. In this case, it was his grandfather who had taught him. And this one really made an impression. Don't try to join wood based on measurement alone, but utilize the wood's personality as well. So each tree is unique. And as I was saying, for the Western carpenter, yeah, it's about the dimensions and the size as it fit, right? It says, no, it's about this thing, this tree, because it's going to continue to change. It will continue to change throughout the life of the building. And another was the hearts of the carpenter should be matched in the same way the personality of the wood is. And again, this took a long time. I really wasn't until I was in my 40s or 50s when I was managing people, teams. I went, yeah, this is about team management, A lot of what the carpenter does is team management, but one of the bigger things that he does, this is only a compassionate master can mold his carpenters into a unified team. So I understood this later as well. What he is doing is providing a path for his apprentices. That, in a way, he is very Buddhist. He is a temple carpenter. His family's been associated with temples for centuries. He is a deeply devout Buddhist. He is helping his apprentices overcome their bad karma to replace it with good karma, with good works, and each of them can find their own path through that. And this was something that took a long time, decades, for me to eventually realize that's what he was doing, that he never said that overtly. So, when I think about what was it, the most important things were the invisibles. Of course, the building, the wood, that's all exquisite. But the important things were the invisibles, and these are ways of knowing. How does he know? How do they know? Based on touching and smelling the wood, where it grew, but they know. These aspects of visualizing change in the future, how do they develop that ability to visualize that? It's all, in a way, very kind of mysterious, but it is also human. This is simply how humans are. And at one point, one of the carpenters asked me, he says, Brown-san, you're American, why do you care so much about this Japanese, carpentry? I said, from my point of view, you guys are showing what human beings are capable of. You are showing the peak accomplishment of humans in this area of carpentry. So you are, important for the rest of humanity. And he went, oh. Naruhodo. He was really happy to hear that. So there's a picture of me on the building site, and young, and I had hair under the helmet. So it was really a great thing. So yes, that became a book. The first edition was 1989, and the revised one, which Wendy had, was published in 2014, and a more recent release as well. But I'm also interested in other things as well, because I came, like I said, and I realized I didn't know anything about Japan. based on being in Tokyo. So became very interested in contemporary life and why things were done the way they were, and particularly in design and accommodating to limited space, because every architect here, every house I visited, every one I saw in the magazine, they were dealing with these incredible spatial constraints, and that became one book that deals a lot more with solutions for storage and things. I looked at, people's ideal lifestyle. What is the ideal lifestyle? How has that changed in Japan? Like, particularly in the post-war period, looking at manufactured housing and that sort of thing, and that whole process by where people are sort of rejecting most of their past, but still trying to maintain a little, hold on some of that. And then another book about compact housing. Again, also looking more at small ecological footprint, again, design in general, limited resources. And this sort of led me to a conference in Sun Valley in 2006. And I realized through the conversations with the other practitioners of sustainability that the forestry people really needed to know what the watershed people knew, and those watershed people needed to know what the agriculture people were doing, and they needed to know what the geologists were doing and what the livestock people were doing. They were speaking the same language, right? And they understood that their work was very, very connected and overlapped, and they needed each other. And I had heard a lot of anecdotes about the Edo period. I, of course, was familiar with the architecture and the buildings, etc. And I just decided that I would research that and for the benefit of people outside of Japan, and realized that in fact Japanese people didn't know. And I'll talk about that in a little more detail. It has to do with specialization. This is a new edition which was supposed to be out this month, but because of supply chain issues it's delayed until June, I was told. And there's a Japanese edition, there's also a Korean edition. And one more thing, yesterday Alex was mentioning Takishita-san in his book, which I edited that book, which was extensive rewrite in fact, and I got to know him very well through that process, and we're still also good friends. So I'm left with this question: what are we preserving? What is it that we think is valuable enough, worthwhile enough that we're preserving it? And again, I think there's a difference between what Kyle mentioned as the hard parts and the soft parts, or rather the physical things and the invisible. So this is something I want to dwell on a little bit. Again, we'll go back to the Edo period. 80% of the population were peasants. We call them peasants. This is a caste society. 80% of them were basically doing farming and living this way, living in Minka. You had big populations in the cities, but they were vastly, vastly outnumbered by the peasants. And this is sort of, somewhat in scale, the rural population, urban population. Most of the rural population is farmers. You also have, fishermen, other people doing that, woods people, forestry people as well. Often they're also doing farming. Urban population is mainly commoners, but also some samurai and some clerics, monks and priests, etc. And they're different, they're separate, but there's a lot of shared characteristics. So the main thing is, this was the way everybody was living. And that, to me is somehow significant. If you've ever been to like a historical museum like of Yayoi or Jomon period buildings that are reconstructed, it's really interesting. I mean, the archaeology is very well developed. They really have a good idea. They're basically Minka, thatch roof, fire in the middle, a pit. The structure is, lashed together, poles lashed together and covered with thatch. It's smoky and it's dim, and I think that one day when I realized that Minka structures, the roof structures, are basically lashed together. This is actually like a Neolithic technology which was still used, and in fact we're still doing it now. I mean, tying with rope. This was before they had joints, before they had the tools to make joints. They could lash things together. So there's this incredible continuity from this, very, very ancient, prehistoric, pre-literate, technical society, and they were very advanced in their way. We can't, not to diminish that. There's this direct connection that when you're in a Minka, you are basically somehow experiencing something that people thousands of years ago also experienced. And I think some of you know, the first buildings that were raised in Japan were storehouses, and this sort of has led to shrine architecture, etc. And these illustrations from a great book, maybe you know it, Japanese Homes and Lifestyles, by Inaba and Nakayama, which I really like the illustrations. They're very, very good. This is Heian period. Again, it's very familiar. Here's the doma, the earthen floor. There was no tatami. Tatami were later. It's kind of some wooden boards, and then covered with goza, woven straw mats, etc. And there's a lot of poverty. I mean, it was not not a lot of possessions, which was a key characteristic for a lot of the time. And then it looks very, very much like Minka from centuries later as well. This one would be like Edo period, where what we think of as Minka, really this is when it is finalized and most of its characteristics. So there's the earthen floor, the kitchen probably has a kamado, clay stove, and a wooden floor area, a hiroma, or called other things, itama, and then some other rooms perhaps, maybe not. And this is from my book, was again showing those basic characteristics. They almost always have a doma, which is a work area. And again, the thing about a Minka, it is a place for work. And then a wooden floored area, which is, among other things, the main communication space, also a workspace. People will be doing their weaving, lots of other craft work they'll be doing there. And then some other rooms, like the nando for sleeping, maybe a zashiki, but these are later and represent affluence, really. Maybe you guys know, like tatami mats, in the Heian period, only aristocrats had a tatami mat. They had like two, maybe in the middle of a wooden floor, and they could sit on that comfortably. And Momoyama period, basically monks said, yes, cover the whole floor with them. And we can lie down and recline, and it can be very comfortable. It took centuries for this to trickle down to common people, and for a long time, only a wealthy farmer would have had tatami mats. Certainly by the end of the Edo period, it became much more common. Again, the structure, this aspect that the roof is lashed together means it can be built by non-specialists. And again, in the farm community, farmers are multitaskers. They do a lot of things, but carpentry really is a specialized skill. And often, usually the case when someone wanted to build a new houses, they would ask carpenters who generally were itinerant. They would go from village to village, and they would construct the framework, and then everyone in the village would pitch in and assemble the roof and lash it all together, and then thatch it. So there was a kind of a combination of very, very specialized, highly technically proficient skill, and then this Neolithic technology that anybody can do with rope. So it's, to me, very, very fascinating. And of course, another thing that's interesting to me is that there's not that big a difference between the temple carpenter, the work, the joints, and what you find in a Minka, or what you would find in a Nagaya tenement house in Edo or any other city. It's the same kind of joinery. Maybe the materials are different, maybe slightly different level of care and finish, but it's the same kind of joints. And to me, that also shows a level of cultural development of expertise that was very, very pervasive in society. So yeah, this is typical. This is a typical, Minka. And the doma, the tataki, this is also very, very interesting. Kyle knows a lot about it. I thought maybe he would talk about this today. It's not just earth, it's sort of clay mixed with lime and other things that it gets down, becomes very, very hard. Again, Minka, we're hearing even just talking about Akia banks and in different prefectures and different places, what's available is all different. And of course, the Minka, there's a lot of consistency around the country, and then an incredible amount of variety as well. So this is at the Nihon Minka-en in Kawasaki, and there's also Minka-en in Osaka, open air museum. And I urge everyone, if you haven't gone, just to visit these places, because you can see a lot and learn a lot about Minka. And there's so much regional variation, the differences between the Minka of a prominent, affluent farmer and one of just an average person is very evident. There's change over time. This is the famous ones in Shirakawa-go, the Gashozukuri, which I think this was, the upper stories were used for raising silkworms, right? So this is in effect an industrial building. This is like a factory, and the people are living there, and big families too, extended families, not just the parents, but of course grandparents and aunts and uncles, and some cousins probably, and then some people who are just working who are not related. They were very, very big operations, and you know, it's interesting that these became some of the more noticeable, or the notable ones, the first ones to become, what do you call it, World Heritage properties in the 1990s. So this is a good book too. What is Japanese Architecture by Nishi and Hozumi? Very well illustrated. Again, I love the illustrations. They have a lot about Minka in there. And you just look, you know, different parts of the country, different regions, they're different. Some are really different, some are just a little bit different. And when I look at this, it just, you know, impresses on me that Minka were very evolved. You know, they've evolved in lots of directions, lots of variety, lots of accommodations to local climate, local landscape, local agricultural processes, local social dynamics. There was an incredible variety. And again, as I'm listening and looking at Minka now and what people are doing with them, what they're thinking of doing with them, I think this evolution is continuing. And I think that's one of the things that we're all doing is helping Minka evolve into the next phase. And of course, not many people are actually doing that in order to continue the agricultural lifestyle, but they still are doing it. And then, maybe you all like tea houses. This is a famous one at Katsura Rikyu called the Shokin-tei, 17th century. The aesthetic of tea intentionally is one of impoverishment. That you get rid of all of the accoutrements of your wealth and your status, and you become as simple as possible and in a way mimic the poorest peasant, the life of the poorest peasant. So the tea houses are very much based on or use the same vernacular as farmhouses. Not all of them, some of them don't, but clearly this one with the thatched roof, etc. And this is designed to look like it had been added onto and changed over time. This is very, you know, in a way, certainly sophisticated design. You know, it's kind of like Marie Antoinette's, where she played milkmaid, kind of similar to that. But so there's something virtuous. It communicated something of virtue to people of other classes, that they would like to emulate farmers who were considered to be virtuous and certainly were of a higher status than merchants and others. So I'll go talk a little bit about this sort of environmental side. You know, for us, things like, you know, water, forests, energy, waste, food. If you're going to a university and to become a specialist, you will specialize in like one of these, and you'll learn a lot about one of them. We consider them to be separate, but of course they're connected. And I think Japanese traditionally understood those connections very, very well. And it may not be in the sense of science that we think of it, but through centuries of observation. They understand that, basically, food and forest are going to be connected. If you are trying to expand your agricultural land, you may have to cut down forests. And what is the cost of that? What are the penalties of that? If you have something like water and energy, they're connected by a vector. Anytime you make hot water. And of course, at the Edo period, one of the keys was that the country had been deforested in the previous centuries, and so preserving the forest and restoring the forest was the main priority, the highest priority. So anything you can do when you're making hot water to minimize the use of energy is good. That's a benefit. It will help both things along those vectors. So this kind of sensibility was something that I think we lost, and certainly Japan lost in the modernization process. Typical agricultural landscape, and this is a little different. We have narrower valleys here, but basically the agriculture, the rice paddies are in the floor of the valley. There's almost always a river. Farmsteads are sort of on the sides in land that's not going to be very useful for farming generally. The lower hillsides can be used for other farming, for vegetables or orchards, etc. And there's an incredible amount of variation to this. In many cases you'll find the farmhouses right in the middle as well, but this is pretty much the case. And the surrounding mountains, of course, the Satoyama. which is jointly used for meeting a lot of other needs. So this is a sort of farmstead where there's the main house usually, and some outbuildings, maybe kura, maybe stable, maybe sheds. Almost always a pond, which is not for drinking, but for every other thing, for washing or soaking rice bales. Usually like a kitchen garden. The trees are generally carefully selected. Tall ones for windbreak. Often these would be nut trees, walnuts, etc., fruit trees. So the food is being provided around the farm itself. Usually bamboo groves, and of course, problem being, as we know, it can be very invasive, but there's a lot of need for bamboo for a lot of things around the farm, so that's done. And then there's the satoyama, which people would enter for gathering their firewood, for gathering foodstuffs, mushrooms, sansai, which I will point out that, prior to agriculture arriving in Japan, which was basically, the Yayoi period, that's what everyone ate. So anytime you're eating sansai, warabi, or those things, which I love that, like sansai soba and stuff, it's great. But you're actually experiencing the diet of the prehistoric Japanese. Just like when you're looking at your Minka roof lashed together, you're experiencing it as well. So, there's some things, I write about this, most of these illustrations come from Just Enough. The key was to obtain fuel without damaging the health of the forest. So in almost every case, in almost every village, people were prohibited from cutting trees to use them for firewood. You could get permission to cut a tree that had blown down in a typhoon, but basically had to use what had fallen naturally. And if you are living in the same environment for generations, for centuries, you have a very good idea of how much wood will fall, how much will be available, and you need to limit your consumption of that to that supply. It's the opposite of ours now, thinking, well, we need more energy, we're just going to make more energy. And of course we see the costs of that from the use of fossil fuels in particular, and other things like not being able to just load up a big wagon with an ox carrying it. No, people were generally required to carry it out on their backs. And this puts a natural limit on the amount that is consumed. And of course, if someone wants to open, let's say, a pottery or maybe a metalsmith shop, which needs more fuel, that would be a big discussion going on in the village before that's allowed, to understand the impacts that would have on the general fuel supply. And we see this also reflected in the design of kamado, of these stoves, different fireboxes, depending on the quantity of heat you need. You're going to cook a little pot, you're going to cook a big pot, you can use a different firebox. Very, very efficient. These things, these lips seal very well. Heat is not escaping, and they burn wood, but they burn anything. There's a lot of things around the farm that would end up being fuel. Maybe use straw, maybe a lot of other things, and wonderful modular design as well. And of course, this is common in other parts of Asia as well. A lot of this, you'll see similar things in Korea and in China also. Last night, Alex sort of showed this as well. Yeah, they could save on fuel by letting water stay in the sun in the summer months and get to be warm. It's not piping hot, but in the evening that's just right for a bath called a gyozu, which you might call a cat bath, or use that in a teapot, a water pot. Is already warm, so you don't need as much fuel to get it to boiling, and then this water would be recycled back to like the farm's pond. On other ways, the thinking of people, living in Minka, working on farms, had to do with regeneration and using nature without damaging it. So the irrigation was one example where, of course, irrigation channels were dug. Often they're some of the oldest infrastructure that survives, older than a lot of the roads. But basically they would use the natural creeks and ponds as much as possible. And it's all gravity fed. There would be situations where they needed to lift water to another level, and they had sort of foot-powered, water wheels to do that. But basically, like the tameike, the sort of holding ponds, these would be generally natural ponds, sort of put into that use, and the water would be released into the rice paddies, which are usually terraced, and then finally into another body of water. Maybe it's a river, maybe it's another pond, sort of a wetland. And recent research has shown that the water that comes out at the end of this process is cleaner in terms of organic matter, etc., than the water that went in, which is a great principle, that when we use something like water, then we should return water of a better quality. If it's being used in a factory or something, it should be better quality than what went in. This is, I'm sorry that the labels are Japanese, but this is a rice paddy. Again, I want to point out that it is an artificial wetland. It functions environmentally in terms of habitat just like a natural wetland does. So, you know, tadpoles and mosquitoes and the birds that feed on those things and other life, and then the predator birds that feed on the other birds. And of course, it's wet for several months and then it dries out just like natural wetlands do. So it is, you know, artificial. Certainly it's a man-made environment, but it is also one that functions just like a natural environment would. Again, thinking about, you know, economy and material use. Lately there's a lot of conversation about circular economy, circularity, something I'm very, very interested in. Part of that has to do with full use of resources and then upcycling and using things, constantly using all waste products. And rice straw are a great example. Of course, rice is grown to eat and to pay as tax. These farmers were paying a big chunk of their crop every year as tax, and that was white rice. But of course, when rice grows, it has a momi, it has a hull, and today Kyle was talking about using that mixed with lime for making walls. But momi had a lot of uses. You can make scrubbers out of it, you could put it in pillows, you could use it for weights, there's a lot of uses for that. You could just sort of throw some into the compost right away. Or, you know, maybe you could also burn it if you want. Then the rice has a brand called Nuka. And maybe you guys know Nuka miso and using it for making pickles or using it for skin, for cosmetics. There's a lot of uses of that as well. And that leaves the white rice. But the rice straw, the wara, is sort of amazing because people use it for everything. It was so abundant. It was a pure byproduct of making this valuable rice to eat, but it's used for you know, everything from clothing to sandals to bags to floor mats to raincoats to hats. And of course, when those are, you know, finished, and these things, they're not that durable. They use them for a year or so. You could then compost that. That goes back to the agricultural cycle, back circularly. Or you could maybe burn it and use it for fuel. And once you've burnt that rice straw, it's high in potassium. So the ash has a lot of uses, whether dye, making abrasives, metalworking, a lot of other things. So, and this is, you know, totally used. Everything's totally used, and most of it comes back into the agricultural cycle in some way. And there's a huge social aspect as well. So you may have heard of the word yui, which we translate as mutual assistance. So a very good example is rethatching a roof. And in the West, it would be something like a barn raising, where everyone comes together and let's raise the Smith's barn, you know, and they spend a couple of days doing that. It's very, very similar. And this is, again, decided on the village basis. Not exactly a democracy, but it's certainly a consensus-based process where this year they'll say, well, the north face of the Tanaka's roof, we will do that. And they'll gather the kaya from the communal field, and there's a role for everybody in the community, whether they're kids, whether they're elderly, whether they're able-bodied and skilled, whether they're unskilled, there's something for everybody to do. And I pointed out that it's work, but it's also a ritualized enactment of social relations. It's the theater of society. Almost like a festival. And in case of thatching, it was very common that the men, there was this big needle, either bamboo or wood, with the rope to tie the thatch down, and the women would be under there pulling this needle down. So there's also something kind of men-women relationships, sexual relationships also implied there. So this is something we've pretty much lost. It's a little bit left in the neighborhood, you know, chonai kai, but it's almost lost. And thatching, of course, became obsolete. That's why we have all of these buildings covered with the thatch roof covered with tin sheeting, etc. But when, I think my impression is, and I'd like to hear from others what they think, when Shirakawa-go, when those houses were made, you know, World Heritage Sites, then it became necessary to keep rethatching them. And a lot of people were trained, have been trained. There are people coming from all over the country learning how to do thatching, and I think you are now able to find thatchers all around the country in greater number than you were probably 50 years ago. On the other side, they're learning this style of thatching. And I think we heard from Alex yesterday talking about this discussion with the thatch craftsmen, who wanted to do a certain style that he learned. Every place had their own local style, but in fact, it's sort of narrowed. The variety has narrowed. They can reproduce it. They can look at older versions, but basically, it's sort of more of a unified style. So, time-wise, I've got to keep an eye on that. So this is sort of the relationships between the city and the rural areas. So the forests are providing wood and charcoal, and the farmers are sending vegetables, and the cities are sending their human waste. It was used for everything, and they discovered that this was great for improving agricultural yield. Oceans providing both food and some of the waste products are also going to agriculture, and water's used for everything, for transport and power and for people to drink. And I sort of tried to diagram this in a bigger way. So this is the deep forest, which is mainly a source for lumber. And this would be the Satoyama. And sometimes there's a conflict when someone has gotten permission to cut trees in the Satoyama. There would be conflicts. This is the watershed, and something many of you know, it requires a huge watershed area to provide like irrigation water for farming. A huge area, many times the size of the farming itself or the habitation. Habitation zones, I would say this I'm calling a hillside cultivation, surrounded by trees probably. This is like farmsteads, sort of abstracted. Also windbreak surrounded, maybe a pond. This is the irrigated cultivation area with the irrigation and ponds. And ultimately that water's going back to the ocean. We want to do that in a way that it's unimpeded and undamaged. I can sort of zoom in, I think. And then the city is sending things back. So, and ultimately it's all powered by the sun. There's not any other major energy sources. Even trees, as we know, that's solar energy that you're actually turning back into fire. But it's basically a solar energy powered system, both urban and rural. And a lot of interchange, a lot of things connected. So in the last few minutes, again, I want to ask the question, what is it we're preserving? This is partly rhetorical. It's one thing to preserve a building, but what about these invisibles? What can we do? What can we learn? What can we bring from this way of thinking, these ways of thinking, that can help us? And my argument has been that this Edo model, the traditional Japanese model, is an ideal prototype for us as we're trying to develop circular economies, as we're trying to develop sustainable economies. Yesterday, it was Marcus. He talked about people's motivations for restoring Minka, and some people he said would be traditionalists, some would be pragmatists, and some would be commercialists. And there may be others as well. Others as well. I really like that. I also really appreciated that he pointed out the importance of stewardship. Because again, we're thinking, maybe we're not thinking in 1,000 years, but we are hopefully thinking about the generations that come later. And recently, I've been involved with a project in Chiba, and it's called the Kazusa no Mori Suzukate Saisei Project. So this is a Minka from the Suzuka family. Built around 1750, not exactly sure. It's in Chonan in Chiba, which is a rural area that actually has quite a few Minka. And the thatched roof is covered with tin. The floor layout is very typical in many ways. Has a doma. This is the hiroma, they call it a dei. Here's the irori. There's a nando for sleeping on the side. It also has a zashiki, so a nice Japanese room, and it has an okunoma, which I'll show pictures of, and then something called a gojo, this little 5-mat, almost like a corridor. The building was lived in until 50 years ago, and then they built a newer house next to it. And Mr. Suzuka now is in his 70s, and he grew up here, and so he's a source of a lot of information. A lot of it's in sort of bad shape. It needs work, and the idea of this project is to restore this as kind of an educational and training facility. So this is the main door, the Odo, and you go in and, structurally it's in great shape. There is one part, I'll show you a picture, where there's some leakage from the roof that sort of ruined one corner of the house, but it's actually in very, very good shape. It has, I would say, great bones. I love these sort of storage things, these like shoe boxes underneath there. Such a nice thing where, sort of sit there to put your shoes on. It's just, who evolved that idea? I don't know. This is sort of the beams, etc. Very, very, good structure. This is towards the back of the house that needs work. It has these very unusual wall decorations. And I don't know the story. This is now being researched, but it's sort of incised into the plaster, like leaves were sort of pressed in, and then the plaster sort of carved away in the shape of a fan to leave this sort of leaf design. I've never seen this anywhere else. I don't know who did it or why. And this is the okunoma, which is got the tokonoma and the chigaidana. This is the dressing room, but again, it had leakage from the roof and it's sort of ruined, so that will need to be reconstructed. And of course, places like this, people just leave stuff, whoever used this last 50 years ago just left it where it was, and it's still there. But the nice thing about it is, this is the house. It comes with about 10 hectares of forest. And the people who have started the project, the key person is a forester. He has a lumber business, and he is very interested in traditional forestry practices and wants to restore the entire Satoyama and also the forest as a place to learn and practice and sort of restore these traditional ways of doing things. So it's going to be sort of an educational project, and the city, the town is interested. They will give some support, but it's not really clear yet exactly much. This is one of the paths into the forest, and there is rice paddies, and there's also some other farm fields. It's a very, very beautiful area, and right next to Tokyo, which is unusual, right? I don't know if any of you are in Tokyo, you're looking for Minka, you can find some in Chiba, I'm sure. So it's very, very interesting, and this was the sort of opening kickoff of the project last year, and so I'm optimistic about this. Now it's at the step of doing the historical research, and then as we're sort of conceptualizing what kind of programs to have here. So the other thing I want to point out, though, is that one of the key people, the person who's the forester, Mr. Iwakoshi here, suffered a stroke recently, and so it just reminds me. So he was the driving force. I think it will continue. He will be involved. He's rehabilitating, etc. But so many interesting and vital projects depend on one key person, one visionary somewhere. Almost every town that I've visited in Japan where there is a very nice program to restore, for instance, Minka and Machiya, there's usually one person. Maybe it's a businessman, maybe it's someone in local government, and that person is somehow able to persuade others, a bit charismatic. But when they're gone, then maybe that stuff doesn't continue. So I don't think we can ever overestimate the importance of visionaries and people who are doing the projects, also to delegate and to train the people to take over after them, just like Master Nishioka did. So that's the end of this. I guess I didn't go over time. I think I'm happy to take questions. Do you have time for questions? Yes, I would throw it out. What are we preserving? Oh, who wants to make a stab? Yes.
This is kind of made a good impression on me. And after I read that, I felt like I want to live there. And I wondered if not just buy my own house and fix it up or whatever, but the whole village and all the support.
Yeah.
Because it didn't function unless everybody was involved. And I was just wondering if you had thoughts on how to recreate that kind of a community, because if we do, someday, if energy is too expensive that we can't afford it, and then the whole economy collapses, or we may be forced to live that way anyway.
like Kyle said today, we're fucked.
Yeah.
And we laugh at it, but again, the challenge, this huge challenge is the way our society has evolved and the fragmentation and isolation, and many of us had kind of both positive and negative experiences over the course of the pandemic, because people are now thinking about what's important and they're spending more time with their families and more time trying to take care of themselves and take care of the people around them, at the same time that we're isolated and cut off from other contacts. So I think I wouldn't, again, underestimate how difficult it will be, but we do see lots of interesting projects, co-housing, communities coming together for shared purposes, shared living. There's a lot of people doing that. So I do think it is possible, but it's not the same as an organic community that has sort of evolved and grown in a natural way, connected to one place. We are always going to be trying to simulate that to some degree, I think, although maybe we are now inventing something different and equally human and supportive. I would like to believe that's possible. But then I'd say we're all in the minority as well. The rest of society, most of it is going in a very, very different direction with a lot of momentum. So I won't underestimate the difficulty of it, right? Anyone else? What are we preserving? So preserving community relations, right? That's something we want to preserve. Yeah.
Some sense of history.
Sense of history.
You see
Yeah.
you see so many antiques, so much old furniture thrown away and crossed out and it's still used or
Yeah.
repaired or.
And why is that? Again, the same reasons. Like my mother-in-law, she didn't want tons, so she would buy crap, furniture from the furniture store. She could have wonderful antiques, and she didn't want them because, again, it had someone's bad karma.
The figure is very clever. It's
Yeah.
very clever for the product it's selling, but it's not sustainable.
Well, yeah, our planned obsolescence and this expectation that one, we need a growth economy, which EDA was not. This was clearly, we're going to not have growth. We're going to do everything with what we have. We're not going to find new markets. We're not going to import, resources or export. We're going to do it just here. And it still had an increasing quality of life over 2.5 centuries. So this was, in a way, very, very inspired.
But so with modern buildings, he's found that if it's 50 years old, it's considered very old.
Yeah, I see this all the time.
I'm from the UK. My sister's old house is 400 years old.
Yeah, good. I have a friend who also restored a 300-year-old house in England as well. And it was like, great, stone. So for me, it's about, again, growing up in New Orleans, those things we're talking about listening to the houses, the neighborhoods, and everything was always talking to us all the time. And I think people naturally understood that, even if they didn't put it in those terms. And the problem is new things. I'm in Tokyo, right? And a building will disappear, and I will say, my God, I don't remember what was there last week. I'm walking by every day. I'm not even seeing it. It's not talking to me at all. So for me, that's the problem. People don't realize that these things do inform us about a lot of things, especially history and identity. And this process of real estate development of just, trashing all that just to extract value from the land. It's like an extraction industry. Just let's get the money out of it. I really think that's incredibly destructive, even in Tokyo. So
I guess the collective consciousness
Yeah.
in the past was sustainability,
yeah,
whereas the collective consciousness today is consumerism.
yeah.
It's really what everybody thinks.
It is global, isn't it, too?
It's global.
I mean, if you have traveled to developing countries or, and people have chronicled this, societies that were very content enter the consumer era, and suddenly people are very discontented because they don't have what they think they should have. And I don't know how that can be reversed.
Well,
I don't
it
know.
needs to change the psychology.
That's a huge thing.
That is a huge thing.
But of course it's happening.
Civilizational change.
Of course, yes, it is civilizational change. But on the good side, the positive side, these developments are fairly recent, this degree of consumerism. again, we can really think of 20th century. It was happening in the 19th century, et cetera, but really 20th century is where this stuff really
The
got.
20th century was the energy revolution.
Yeah.
And sustainable energy is probably the avenue that heads us back to sustainability. Consciousness.
It's certainly going to be central, right?
If we can get rid of fossil fuels,
Yeah.
ultimately.
I think it's going to be central, but then I would also, again, maybe I'm a dreamer, but alternate, again, economic systems that are not based on some sort of artificially generated growth. And again, Edo period, I didn't talk about it today, but one of the fascinating things to me was that there was a cash economy. The merchants were doing it for money, but rice was also a medium of exchange. The farmers could generate more value, more wealth by growing more rice, and that was used as tax. So you have those two. And then the circular sort of gift exchange economy. And it was particularly the case of samurai, who were not allowed to do business, but they were on fixed incomes that had been decided 200 years ago. Inflation happens, they can't make ends meet, so they start to grow their own food. But they can't sell it, although they can distribute it. They can grow in excess, and this is keeping them alive literally. So there were these three interlinked and overlapping economic systems, of which the cash economy was only one. It was important, but it would not have functioned without the other ones as well. So I do think there's good reasons to look at other kinds of economic systems. Again, I don't know, everything's going to go to crypto, and it's happening quickly. And I don't know that that's going to be good at all, but I think something has to change in terms of our sense of value and valuation. Yeah. Yeah.
I think to answer your question again, I think one thing I've found from a lot of presentations here and from yours, but also, engaging in a Minka becomes a life project and a project where every day is this learning experience. And when a house is just a commodity and someone you're paying a landlord money to, this is a reflection of the meaning of life. It's just, it's just something I throw money at, and I have to make money to throw money, and then I die. But when you have a Minka, it's like it becomes a university where every single day there's, oh my God, okay, now there's a leak. Well, how do we fix the leak? We need to catch up with this. Oh, I can contact this individual. It's this infinite portal. And
creativity and inventiveness and all this stuff becoming very human, right? To do all that stuff. I mean, this is the way people, I think, have evolved to live, was in that kind of engagement and depth of engagement. But we are also very adaptable, and this is our own undoing, that we can be satisfied living without a lot of that, if we have something else that we think is important. Yeah?
I just want to make one more comment, which is that this kind of sustainable type of living people think there's a lot of hardship to it, and there probably is, but there was an aesthetic to it, which you pointed out in your book, and also in your slides, that aesthetic to poverty. And if people could see that, it's like, that could be another attraction for, if you're trying to create a community, get people from the outside, that we're doing all these virtuous things, but it's also a beautiful place. And
it has to be beautiful, right?
And if somebody made that kind of presentation, like, you can live this kind of life, but it's also beautiful, I want to go to that place.
Yeah, it has to be beautiful, and everything in this period, almost everything we see that Japan has bequeathed us in terms of material design and stuff, is beautiful, right? It's beautiful, and there's no reason that the great sustainable design can't be beautiful. It should be, and yet I remember, watching like television dramas back in the 90s when I was really getting engaged with this, and the desirable lifestyle was always someone living in Daikanyama mansion, driving a BMW, at a fancy restaurant, eating steak, and that was everyone supposed to go, oh, I want to live that way. And I said, why doesn't someone make a television series about people living sustainably, in a wonderful environment that everyone will say, wow, that's so cool, I want to live that way. Media has a big role to play in presenting and helping people desire these things. And I guess maybe it'll happen, I'm not sure. We're out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time,
we keep
I'm
talking.
afraid. Hopefully you can continue the conversation as we all are ushered
Yeah.
up the hill. In the meantime, thank
you
you
very much.
so much for
I appreciate
coming.
it. It was great to be invited.
We are now going up the hill. We're going to have a group picture.
Yeah.
the drawing for Ukraine. I don't know, is anybody going back to Kyoto and would like an articulate
Yeah, I need to get to
horror
Kyoto
writer?
to make it back to Yokohama. If anyone's going and wants to give me a ride.
Also, Derek.
Are you? What time are you going? Oh, you need a ride yourself? Okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Of course.